The late-day sun poured sideways across the canyon, painting the red cliffs with a dull fire as Leah kept her jet tight on the lead's wing. Wind drifted softly across the ridgeline, invisible until it pushed a swirl of dust through a gap 2,000 feet below. The formation was quiet, routine. Just one more sweep across high desert terrain layered in heat shimmer and rust-colored stone. Her fingers rested on the trembling control stick, light but aware. The cockpit interior hummed with instrument chatter, nothing urgent. Sweat from her temple rolled down her jawline, soaking into the collar of her flight suit. She hadn't said a word in nearly 5 minutes. There was nothing to say. Her world was framed by canopy glass, sun glare, and the outline of the other Viper floating steady beside her. Then the radar pinged. She blinked. One contact. Fast. Then another pulse. Closer. Closing fast from high 3 o'clock. The radio cracked. 2. Break east. Fast mover inbound. We are not alone. Leah peeled hard to the right, nose down, throttling up, but something resisted under her palm. The Viper surged, but her left hand yanked the throttle again. Still jammed forward. Full power. Locked. The afterburner flickered once and held steady. "Throttle's stuck," she muttered, too low for the mic to catch. She didn't need the reply. Her instruments told the story. Airspeed climbing past 600, engine temp rising, and no resistance in the lever. It was jammed wide open. 2. Confirm status. Came the call again. Her lead was looping upward, scanning for the threat. It hadn't broken visual yet, just radar tone and intent. "I'm good. Throttle's locked forward," Leah said flatly. "Go high and punch out east. I'm staying in the cut." A pause. Then, "Copy. Be safe." 2. The moment she said it, her fingers firmed on the stick. The lead's jet peeled away in a climbing arc, angling toward clear sky. She stayed low, descending into the canyon's first turn. The ridgeline knifed toward her windscreen. The world compressed. The calm was over. The throttle had jammed only once in her career. That time it had happened in a simulator during a failure drill. But the sim never captured the sound, the hollow pitch of an engine pulling too hard for too long, or the rising hum through the panels when speed climbed beyond comfortable margins. She dipped beneath the first canyon wall, wings nearly horizontal, altitude 300 feet, airspeed climbing. The stick vibrated under her fingers, not violent, but constant, like a warning whispered too late. She checked left and right. No visual. The radar still pinged off and on, confirming the other aircraft was stalking from high altitude. It hadn't committed yet. It was waiting, watching. The canyon narrowed. Red cliffs closed in like opposing blades. She adjusted trim slightly, not to steer, but to let the jet settle into a line of motion it wanted to follow. Her arms stayed fluid. The nose bounced once in turbulence and then flattened. Behind her, the engine roared without modulation. No control over throttle. No taper. No delay. Just speed. Pure and continuous. This wasn't going to be a turn-and-burn fight. It couldn't be. She didn't have the power margins to play chicken in a vertical climb, and without throttle modulation, energy management was a fantasy. Her heart beat slower than her airspeed. That had always been her signature, even in training. Instructors noted it. Calm pulse, clear hands. She didn't twitch, didn't overcorrect. That's what had earned her this seat, in this jet. Another ping, this one from behind, high angle, 40 degrees off nose. She made her choice. Pushed further into the canyon, ignoring the burn of sweat and the ache in her forearms as G-forces built on the inside turn. The Viper tucked beneath an overhanging shelf of stone, engines howling. Sunlight disappeared for a moment as the cliff shadow washed over the cockpit. She wasn't going to beat this threat in open sky, not with speed she couldn't control. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't need to control it. Maybe she needed to let it run. The canyon curved again. She held the line. Somewhere behind her, unseen and silent, something faster was coming. But Leah had stopped thinking about catching or escaping. The throttle was stuck. Her wingman was gone. And the red rock cliffs in front of her offered only one path forward. The control stick trembled again. Not a failure, just motion. Her breathing slowed. The enemy wasn't on her six yet. But it would be soon. She leaned her shoulders into the seat, adjusted her grip, and focused on the terrain ahead. Control wasn't always about slowing down. Sometimes it was about staying steady with the storm at your back. The canyon twisted beneath Leah like a winding scar through the earth. Her Viper rode just above the floor, hugging the contours, every turn shaving air between her wingtips and rock. The engine still surged at full power, and the jammed throttle hadn't budged. She no longer pulled against it. She stopped trying 5 minutes ago. The first missile tone came and went, a quick chirp in her headset, followed by silence, then another, longer warning from the rear right quadrant. Still no visual. Her radar gave her slashing vectors a ghost of the other jet arcing and falling, faster in climb, wider in loop. The pattern was starting to repeat. High attack angle, overshoot, dive, circle back. The first time, it almost worked. Leah had taken a left-hand cut too wide, and the enemy jet had dropped in behind her at high speed. But she rolled under a ledge and vanished before it could lock. Now she flew tighter, more deliberately, less like a chase, and more like a dance she knew, before the music played. Dust peeled from her tail like smoke. The sun was low now, bending the canyon shadows sideways across her canopy. She used them. She didn't fly the fastest line anymore. She flew the one with the most shade, the one that broke visual, the one that kept the other pilot guessing. Her breathing slowed. The Viper's cockpit was a sauna, sweat running from her scalp down her spine. But the stick was steady in her hands. It still trembled from speed and terrain buffeting, but her grip no longer fought it. She let the motion pass through her arms, not into them. She wasn't flying the jet now so much as she was interpreting it. Another ping from the radar. Behind her again. Offset left. The enemy was trying the same arc. Fast approach, hoping for a clean shot in a clearing. But Leah had no intention of giving one. She dropped altitude slightly, cut through a blind turn, then dipped beneath a natural arch where the rock twisted across a narrow ravine like a crooked rib. Her shadow slid across the canyon wall beside her. Then it vanished. She pulled tighter, hugged the inside curve, and rode the lift of the terrain itself to keep her nose level. The lock warning came again, then died. The other pilot was too aggressive, too high speed. They were flying above the terrain, trying to force a shot from dominance. Leah was inside it. That was the difference. She began to bait. On the next straight stretch, she gave a slight climb, just a few seconds, enough to rise into a small clearing between cliffs, enough to be seen. Then she rolled hard to the right and vanished into a split in the stone. Behind her, the radar caught the tail of the enemy's loop again. Faster this time, closing hard, but too late. She was already gone. The dust trail she left was curling upward, drifting off the rocks like smoke. But the jet itself had slipped under another overhang and flattened its turn around a sandstone pillar. She didn't smile. There was nothing fun about this. But the pattern was becoming clearer. The other pilot had speed and tech, but they didn't have patience. And patience was what survived in places like this. A small shadow shifted along the canyon wall. It was hers. She saw it flicker as she banked left under a new outcrop. The Viper's fuselage hummed beneath her. Not smooth, but not struggling either. It had accepted the conditions too. Both machine and pilot had stopped trying to outpace the threat. They were now shaping themselves to the space, not the enemy. She passed through a narrow pass so tight that both wingtips flashed white as they caught sun for half a second. Then they vanished back into shade. Her HUD gave a brief airspeed reading 600.2 and a climb angle just under 1 degree. Just enough to hold altitude without pulling away from the terrain. The radar chirped once, faint, distance increasing. Then nothing. Leah adjusted her angle again. This time not to lose the other pilot, but to reappear. She was ready for the next pass, but this time it would be on her terms. The canyon wound on. The canyon widened. Just for a moment. Leah let the Viper lift slightly, enough to cast a shadow on the ridgeline. She didn't hold the exposure for long, just a second or two, but it was enough. The radar pinged almost immediately. The enemy fighter had seen her. She dropped back into the cut and banked left toward the formation she had been aiming for since the first merge. The box canyon ahead wasn't just any terrain. She had studied its profile on recon maps months ago, marked the angles, memorized the blind turns and elevation jumps. It wasn't safe, but it was predictable. If she could fly it perfectly, it would give her the one edge she needed. The throttle still hadn't moved. Full burn continued to push her forward, but the pressure no longer registered the same way. She felt it, but it didn't control her attention. Her focus had shifted. Now she was not escaping. She was drawing the other jet in. The opening of the box canyon yawned ahead, two vertical walls rising like jagged bookends on either side of a long, winding throat. There was only one way in, and only one way out. No pilot would enter it casually, which was why it had to be forced. She cut sharply around the entrance, flaring slightly as if she meant to climb, then dove instead. The enemy jet responded immediately. A high-speed dive lit up on her rear sensor. They were biting. Leah angled hard into the canyon's throat. The space narrowed fast. The walls drew in close. There were no more flat turns here. Everything became vertical slashes and blind crests. Her HUD flickered as terrain occluded her antenna. Altitude 300 feet, then 200. The jet's warning systems pinged once in protest but did not override control. She was threading a needle with a burning engine. Her eyes scanned for the first landmark. There, a stone arch no more than 50 feet above canyon floor. She pulled up slightly, threading under it with inches to spare. The rush of air and speed scraped past her helmet. The Viper rattled. The next turn came immediately left, almost vertical, and she banked hard into it, pulling the stick toward her chest. The G-force spike hit like a hammer. Vision tunneled. A sharp edge crawled in from her peripheral view. Her stomach rose into her throat, and her breath shortened without warning. She held the stick firm and leaned into the pressure. Her body felt heavy, limbs dragging, breath catching. The canyon wall passed within 10 feet of her right wing, then 5. Her radar warning system screamed again. Lock on. The enemy was still behind her. Faster. Cutting the corner. Her hand slipped for just a second. The stick lurched. Her wingtip kissed stone. The Viper jolted. It was not a direct hit, just a scrape, but dust exploded behind her as the surface of her wing shaved the rock face. A long trail of chalked grit hung in the air behind her, marking the line like a blood trace. She blacked out, only for a moment. The G-load blurred her vision, pressed her back into the seat. Her hands loosened. The cockpit became a tunnel of sound and light, too distant to control. Her head dropped forward. For a heartbeat, the jet flew alone. The nose dipped. The canyon wall loomed ahead, climbing up like the blade of a knife. Then, the control stick vibrated, and the sound returned. Something in her muscle memory re-engaged. Her right hand clenched, her left flexed. The Viper wobbled, nose angled low and left, and she fought the roll. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The machine responded just before it touched stone. She pulled out low, barely clearing a small rock outcrop that jutted from the canyon floor. The airframe groaned, but nothing tore free. Her vision returned in patches, gray in the edges, focus in the center. She steadied her breathing. The enemy jet had overshot. The canyon's path had deceived them. They tried to follow her through the narrow cut, but entered too high and too fast. Their lock failed when she vanished beneath the arch. Their line of sight collapsed in the vertical turn. They hadn't seen the scrape. They hadn't seen the blackout. All they knew was that she had disappeared into stone. She regained altitude slightly, enough to clear the next cut. The engine roared behind her, unchanged. Her systems still flickered, but the stick was stable now, aligned with her will again. She was no longer reacting. She was shaping the fight. Each decision from here would not be an answer to a threat, but a problem given to her opponent. This canyon was hers. The turns, the cuts, the blind crests. They were not obstacles anymore. They were options. Routes she could take or deny. Paths she could lead someone down until they committed too far. Leah didn't check her wing. She knew there would be a scar. That wasn't the point. What mattered was that she had passed through the blade and come out flying. Slower, rattled, but still flying. Her pulse settled into the rhythm again, the kind that ignored warnings and listened only to airframe tension and shadow movement across the rock. The Viper leveled out at 400 feet above canyon floor. The climb shaft was up ahead, a nearly vertical spike of stone with a narrow crack through its center, just wide enough for a jet to slip out the top if flown at the right angle. She would not take it yet. Not until she needed to. Behind her, no new pings came from the radar. The other pilot had lost visual, or was climbing, or hesitating. She had time now, not much, but enough. She circled once inside the box canyon, low and slow, close to the wall. Her jet's shadow passed again over red stone, curved and flickering. Control didn't return to her throttle. It never would. But she had taken back something else. Initiative. The walls of the canyon pressed in around Leah as she aligned the Viper's nose toward the narrow vertical cut in the stone. The spire chimney rose like a cleft blade above her, barely wide enough to admit a single aircraft. She'd only ever seen it in topographic renderings. Now it loomed in front of her, in stone and shadow, red and steep and wholly unforgiving. She pulled the nose up and committed to the climb. There was no room for adjustment once inside. The gap was vertical for nearly 400 feet before it opened again at the top, and only a perfectly aligned approach would clear it. The engine screamed behind her, still locked at full thrust, but her airspeed was falling fast. Every second inside the vertical shaft drained her forward motion and turned her into a climbing stone with wings. As she entered the cut, sunlight vanished. The stone on either side was barely 6 feet from her wingtips. Her HUD flickered, altitude rising, speed dropping, 260, 210. Below that, and she risked stall. The jet groaned under her. The warning tones began to build a soft, escalating whine that indicated the edge of aerodynamic tolerance. The stick was no longer trembling from buffeting. It was beginning to resist. Her hands didn't fight it. She didn't panic. She kept her climb shallow inside the shaft, hugging the left seam of the wall. Just as she'd hoped, the rock here held heat. Trapped sunlight from earlier in the day lingered in the stone. As she climbed, she armed countermeasures. The radar pinged. 1 tone, then 2. She was painted from above. The enemy had found her. They were waiting, just as she'd predicted. The climb had been visible. It had taken time. Too much time. All the other pilot needed was a clean shot at the chimney's opening. She didn't break the climb. Not yet. A flick of her finger launched a pair of flares. The twin streaks tore from her fuselage and kissed the wall of the shaft. Heat and smoke flooded the narrow space. The brightness reflected off both sides of the rock, blooming like twin suns trapped in a canyon throat. At the same time, she shifted her hands on the stick and pulled into a stall roll. The Viper hesitated. Then the nose dipped, and the aircraft flipped. The transition was violent but clean. Nose pitched forward, wings rotated flat, and she dropped. Not into a controlled dive, but into a sideways tumble, an aerial coil tight enough to snake back the way she had come. Behind her, the top of the chimney erupted. The enemy fired. She never saw the missile. But the sound cut through the radio silence, an unmistakable electronic scream followed by a distant detonation. Not against her. Against the empty shaft above. By the time the smoke cleared at the top of the spire, Leah was already gone. She slid back down the shaft in reverse profile, engine howling, nose low but controlled. The canyon yawned open beneath her as she dropped back into the terrain she had just climbed out of. Her airspeed climbed again. The stall roll had cost her altitude, but it had bought her survival. The jet rattled as she leveled out again, just over the floor of the canyon. Her HUD blinked briefly. 0 airspeed recorded during the apex of the maneuver, a line she'd never crossed before, not in any simulator, not even during emergency descent drills. 0 was never the target. But she had passed through it and come out flying. The countermeasures had done their job. The rock walls absorbed the heat flare and confused the missile's guidance. The stall roll had placed her below line of sight. The entire move lasted fewer than 8 seconds. Leah exhaled for the first time since entering the shaft. The enemy was behind her now, climbing, likely overshooting the empty chimney. The other pilot had committed too hard. They believed what she showed them. That was the point. In this fight, deception was precision. Vulnerability was a tool, not a flaw. The terrain wrapped around her again, but this time she was not escaping. She was maneuvering. The cockpit alarms quieted. The pressure on the stick returned to normal, though the strain in her arms lingered. Her thighs ached from holding tension through the roll. Her mouth was dry, lips cracked from the heat. But she was still flying. She banked right, low, letting the airframe adjust itself to the wall's curvature. Her Viper's shadow slid across the rock beside her, following her down the canyon like a ghost. The jet no longer surged ahead recklessly. It was fast, yes, but now it moved with intention. The throttle had never freed. She no longer expected it to. Her instruments stabilized. The radar was quiet for now. No lock tones, no pings. She had dropped below the line again, vanished into terrain too tight and layered for the other pilot to see. Above her, the echo of the detonation faded into wind. She pulled into another narrow gap, a lateral slice between 2 vertical ridges. The Viper moved like liquid now, fluid through stone, controlled not by correction, but by shape and space and timing. The climb hadn't failed. It had been a test. The trap wasn't just for her enemy. It was for herself. A threshold she had to cross to know what kind of pilot she really was when options narrowed and physics threatened to take the stick away completely. Her hand rested lightly now, not gripping, not commanding, just present. Precision wasn't always a matter of force. It wasn't even about perfect lines. It was about understanding when to hold a course and when to let it slip free. Her path wasn't clear, but it was hers now. Leah spotted the crosswind pass as soon as the light shifted on the canyon walls. The dust wasn't rising from below. It was dragging sideways, pulled by the corridor's air funnel between 2 massive stone spires. It was the only passage narrow enough, sharp enough, and unstable enough to do what she needed. The Viper trembled slightly as she dipped beneath a low ledge, reorienting her path. The rock formations on either side were smooth and pale from years of scouring wind. They weren't jagged like the canyons behind her. They were honed, wind-carved, polished by violence. Her altitude held at 400 feet. Airspeed was steady 600.8, too fast for most canyon passes, but she wasn't here to slow down. She was here because this was the only place where the environment could do what she could not: end it. The radar gave her a brief contact again. High rear, still trailing. The enemy hadn't abandoned the chase. They were patient now, calculated. They believed they could wait her out, wear her down, force a mistake. Leah would not give them that chance. She guided the Viper toward the mouth of the crosswind cut. The pass was less than 50 feet wide for much of its stretch, a slot between wind-sheared stone faces that ran for nearly 2 miles. Wind pressure didn't just whip through it, it snapped sideways with no pattern, no rhythm, only force. It had downed aircraft before. She knew the record. Pilots who tried to correct their line inside it found themselves flung into stone. But if she didn't correct, if she simply entered and committed, the Viper might pass through. She eased the stick forward, let the jet align. The engine still surged at full thrust. Her throttle hadn't shifted since the first turn of the engagement. That fact didn't matter anymore. The jet's pace was no longer something to resist. It was the one thing she could count on. If she let the aircraft move with the wind not against it, she could hold the line. She crossed into the corridor. Immediately, the air changed. It wasn't just noise. It was presence. Pressure pushed against the canopy from the left, then from below. The sound shifted from hum to thrum, from vibration to physical strike. The HUD indicators shook. Altimeter and airspeed fluctuated. Not wildly, but enough to make any small input a liability. Leah didn't input. She didn't steer. She kept her hands light and her body locked into the seat, letting the airframe absorb the shift. The Viper dipped slightly, corrected itself. A pocket of turbulence slapped the underside of the nose, sending the jet yawing right. She didn't counter. Within seconds, the frame slid back in line. The jet knew the motion. She trusted it. A stream of dust ripped across her left wing like smoke from a fuse. Ahead, the pass tightened further, walls closing to a taper. She heard nothing but wind. The radar screamed once, contact, close, visual trailing. The enemy had entered the corridor. Leah did nothing. She didn't speak. She didn't change elevation. The canyon walls flashed past her canopy in smooth, silver-toned blurs. Her own vapor trails curved sideways behind her, catching the crosswind and spinning like ropes across the chasm. The Viper shook, then stilled, shook again, then stabilized. Her breath stayed even. Her eyes locked on the narrowing gap ahead. No indicators told her she was clear yet. No tone gave comfort, only feel. The sensation of movement, the language of flow. Out of the corner of her eyes, something appeared. Not a shape, just motion. A glint. The enemy jet. It had entered the corridor 5 seconds behind her, and now it was trying to catch up. But it was trying to control the space. Its nose twitched left, then hard right. Correction attempts. Overcorrections. Its approach was clean, but its confidence was breaking. The gusts were doing their work. Wind didn't argue. It bent everything, pilot and airframe alike. The enemy jet dropped slightly, trying to correct again. Leah saw it slip a foot too low. The nose dipped, then snapped up. The correction was too late. A sudden gust caught the tail. The enemy yawed sharply to port. Its fuselage turned sideways, trying to recover angle. It clipped the left wall. The contact wasn't loud. It didn't explode. There was no fireball or scream. Just a muted flash of dust and light as the jet crumpled against the rock face and disappeared from view. Leah didn't look back. She passed through the rest of the corridor without change. Her Viper held its line, shaking, protesting, but unbroken. At the final bend, the wind eased. The air calmed. She exited the canyon and banked wide. No new radar tones followed. The enemy was gone. She circled once in silence, then dropped back to low altitude. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the vibration still echoing through her bones. The crosswind cut faded behind her. Nothing but 2 tall stone walls and a threat of air too fierce to challenge. It had done what she could not. It had decided. Leah didn't feel triumph. There was no rush, no fist in the air. There was only a return to quiet, a realization that her choices had been few, and her margin of error non-existent. But she had flown through the storm, not by strength, not by control, by trust. The Viper continued forward, altitude holding steady. Ahead, the land opened into long, flat stretches of desert rim. The battle was over, not with a kill, but with survival. The canyon fell away behind her as Leah eased the Viper into a slow, rising climb. The sky above was open and clean, the desert dusk stretching out in bands of gold, violet, and fading blue. Her throttle was still jammed forward, still driving the engine at full thrust, but she didn't reach for it anymore. The lever was no longer the problem. It was just part of the aircraft now, part of the motion that had carried her through. She let the climb hold steady, not pushing, not adjusting. The cockpit buzzed faintly with wind vibration, but the panels were quiet. No warnings, no pings. The radar was clean. The enemy had stopped trying. Or maybe the canyon had decided things for both of them. Her breath stayed even. The sweat had dried into her flight suit, leaving salt streaks across her neck and arms. Her gloves were still clipped to her belt. She hadn't needed them since the opening break. Everything since then had been field direct contact with the machine. The sun hovered just above the far rim, casting a deep orange glow across the panel glass. Every edge inside the cockpit glowed faintly, like backlit copper. Outside, the canyon scarred the earth below, its shadows stretching longer with each minute. Wind moved gently, now. More like a memory than a threat. Leah glanced down at the control stick. It still trembled in her hand. A constant, subtle vibration fed through the engine and the skin of the jet. Earlier, it had meant danger, loss of control, but now it was familiar. She didn't grip it tightly. She let it hum beneath her fingers, part of the natural motion, like feeling the road under tires or the tide beneath a keel. Her wingman's voice came through the headset. The tone was light, tinged with disbelief. 2, are you still up? Leah took a breath before responding. Still up, still fast. A pause on the other end. Then, thought you were gone. Didn't see you break out. Never broke out, she said, just stayed low. Another pause, this one respectful. Then silence. The conversation didn't need more. They would debrief later. For now, the only sound was the engine hum and the faint tick of cooling metal as the Viper rose above the final ridgeline. She checked her instruments again. Altitude climbing through 11,000. Airspeed still high, 680. Her HUD flickered in the dim light. Not in error, just adjusting to the dusk. The numbers were familiar now. She had lived inside them for too long today to question their presence. Below, the canyon's walls no longer threatened. They traced a line behind her, etched into the ground like memory. She saw the turn where she'd blacked out, the narrow spire shaft she'd climbed and dropped through, the crosswind corridor she'd entered without promise of coming out. From above, they looked like cuts. From inside, they had been decisions. She didn't feel triumph. There was no celebration in her breath or posture, just stillness, a steady awareness that she had flown with a problem no one could fix and made peace with it. She had learned not to control the storm, but to fly inside it. The Viper's shadow passed over the canyon one final time, stretched thin, fading. The sun slipped lower, casting long lines across the upper deck of the clouds. Distant mountain ridges turned dark. She watched the color bleed slowly from the sky, letting her eyes soften to it. Her hand adjusted the trim by instinct. The aircraft stayed level. She did not radio base yet. There was no rush. Her fuel levels were still safe. She had enough time to glide the final stretch home once she throttled back manually after landing. If landing gear didn't cooperate, she'd deal with it. But for now, she would ride the line. The throttle remained frozen, pushed forward, maxed out. The lever hadn't moved since the first evasive roll in the opening merge. It was still a problem, technically, but she no longer saw it that way. It had become a condition, like wind, like time, something to work with, not fix. Her body ached, shoulders stiff, legs strained from holding turns, hands sore from micro-corrections, but her posture remained upright, her mind clear. This wasn't a mission she'd remember because of how close it came to failure. It was one she would remember because of what came after she stopped trying to pull back. That was the part that mattered. Not the throttle, not the radar. The moment she let the jet do what it was built to do, run. Her wingman rejoined at a distance. No formation, just parallel, silent presence. They both knew this was not the time for chatter. The last curve of sunlight touched the tip of her canopy. Then it was gone, just blue above and red below, fading into each other in silence. She flew forward without change.